The Three Languages. There once lived in Switzerland an old count who had an only son, and he was very stupid and could learn nothing. So his father said to him, "Listen to me, my son. I can get nothing into your head, try as hard as I may. You must go away from here, and I will hand you over to a renowned professor for a whole year." At the end of the year he came home again, and his father asked, "Now, my son, what have you learned?" "Father, I have learnt the language of dogs." "Mercy on us!" cried his father. "Is that all you have learnt? I have sent you away again to another professor in another town." The youth was taken there, and remained with this professor also for another year. When he came back, his father asked him again, "My son, what have you learnt?" He answered, "I have learnt bird language." Then the father flew into a rage and said, "Oh, you hopeless creature! Haven't you been spending all your precious time, and you still learnt nothing? Aren't you ashamed to come into my presence? I will send you to a third professor, but if you learn nothing this time, I won't be your father any longer." The son stopped with the third professor in the same way for the same year, and when he came home again, his father asked, "My son, what have you learnt?" And he answered, "My dear father, this year I have learnt frog language." Thereupon his father flew into a fearful passion, and said, "This creature is my son no longer. I turn him out of the house, and I command you to lead him into the forest and take his life." They led him forth, but then when they were about to kill him, for pity's sake they could not do it, and let him go. Then they took out the eyes and the tongue of a fawn, and ordered that they might take back proofs to the old count. The youth wandered about, and at length came to a castle, where he begged for a night's lodging. "Very well," said the lord of the castle, "if you like to pass the night down there in the old tower you may, but I warn you that it will be at the risk of your life, for it is full of savage dogs. They bark and they howl without ceasing, and for certain hours they must have a man thrown to them, and they devour him at once." The whole neighborhood was distressed by the scourge, but no one could do anything to remedy it. But the youth was not a bit afraid, and said, "Just let me go down to these barking dogs, and give me something I can throw to them. They won't do me any harm." As they would not have anything else, they gave him some food for the savage dogs, and took him down to the tower. The dogs did not bark at him when he entered, but ran round him wagging their tails in the most friendly manner, ate the food he gave to them, and did not so much as touch a hair of his head. The next morning, to the surprise of everyone, he made his appearance again. It is to be said to the lord of the castle, "The dogs have revealed to me in their own language why they have lived there, and bring mischief to the country. They are enchanted and obliged to guard a great treasure from which is hidden under the tower, and will get no rest till it has been dug up. And now that it has to be done, I have also learnt this from them." Everyone who heard this was delighted, and the lord of the castle said he would adopt him as a son if he accomplished the task successfully. He went down to the tower again, and as he looked out to set out to work, he accomplished his task, and brought out a chest full of gold. The howling of the savage dogs was from that time forward heard no more. They entirely disappeared, and the country was delivered from the scourge. After a time he took it in his head to go to Rome. On the way he passed a swamp, in which a number of frogs were croaking. He listened, and when he heard what they were saying, he became quite pensive and sad. For at last he reached Rome, at a moment where the Pope had just died, and there was great doubt among the cardinals who they should have as his successor. They agreed at last that this man, to whom some divine miracle should be manifested, ought to be chosen as Pope. Just as they had come to the decision, the young count entered the church, and suddenly 2 snow-white doves flew down and lighted on his shoulders. The clergy recognized this sign from heaven, and asked him on the spot whether he would be Pope. He was undecided, and knew not whether he was worthy of the post, but the doves told him that he might accept, and then at last he said, "Yes." Thereupon he was anointed and consecrated, and so was fulfilled what he had heard from the frogs on that way, which as he had disturbed them so much, namely, that he should become Pope. He then had to chant Mass. He did not know one word of it, but the two doves sat on his shoulders and whispered it to him. The White Snake. A long time ago there lived a king whose wisdom was celebrated far and wide. Nothing was unknown to him, and news of the most secret transactions seemed to reach him through the air. Now he had one very odd habit. Every day at dinner, when the courtiers had withdrawn, and he was quite alone, a trusted servant had to bring in another dish. It was always covered. Even the servant did not know what it contained, nor anyone else, for the king never uncovered till he was alone. This had gone on for a long time, when one day the servant who carried the dish was overcome by his curiosity, and took the dish to his own room. When he had carefully locked the door, he took the dish cover off, and saw that a white snake was lying upon the dish. At the sight of this he could not resist tasting it, so he cut a piece off, and put it into his mouth. Hardly had he tasted it, however, when he heard a wonderful whispering of delicate voices. He went to the window and listened, and he noticed that the whispers had come from the sparrows outside. They were chattering away and telling each other all kinds of things that they had heard in the woods and in the fields. Eating that snake had given him the power of understanding the language of birds and animals. Now it happened on this day that the queen had lost her most precious ring, and suspicion fell upon this trusted servant, who went about everywhere. The king sent for him, and threatened that if he was not found by the next day, he would be sent to prison. In vain he protested his innocence, and he was not believed. In his grief and anxiety, he went down to the courtyard, and wondered about how he should get out of his difficulty. A number of ducks were lying peaceably amongst the streams, stroking down their feathers with their bills, while they chatted gaily. The servant stood still to listen to them. They were telling each other of their morning's walks and their experiences. Then one of them said something rather fretfully. "I have something lying heavily on my stomach. In my haste I swallowed the queen's ring this morning." The servant quickly seized it by the neck, carried it off into the kitchen, and said to the cook, "Here's a fine fat duck. You better kill it at once." "Yes, indeed," said the cook, weighing it in her hands. It had spared no pains stuffing itself. It should have been roasted long ago. So she killed it, cut it open, and there, sure enough, was the queen's ring. The servant had no difficulty in proving his innocence, and the king, to make up for his injustice, gave the servant leave to ask any favor he liked, and promised him the highest post about the court which he might desire. The servant, however, declined everything but a horse and some money to travel with, as he wanted to wander about for a while, to see the world. His request being granted, he set off upon his travels, and one day came to a pond, where he saw 3 fishes caught among the reeds, gasping for breath. Although it is said that fishes are dumb, he understood their complaint at perishing thus miserably. As he had a compassionate heart, he got off his horse and put the 3 captives back into the water. They wriggled in their joy, stretched up their heads above the water, and cried, "We will remember that you saved us, and reward you for it." He rolled on again, and after a time he had seemed to hear a voice in the sand at his feet. He listened, and heard an ant-king complain, "I wish these human beings and their animals would keep out of our way. Clumsy horses should put his hoof down upon a number of my people in the most heartless way." He turned his horse into a side path, and said the ant-king cried, "We will remember you and reward you." The road now ran through a forest, and he saw a pair of ravens standing by their nest, throwing out their young. "Away with you, you gallows birds," they were saying. "We can't feed you any longer. You are old enough to look after yourselves." The poor little nestlings lay on the ground, fluttering and flapping their wings and crying, "We poor helpless children to feed ourselves, and we can't even fly. We shall die of hunger. There is nothing else for it." The young youth dismounted, killed his horse with his sword, and left the carcass as food for the young ravens. They hopped along to it and cried, "We will remember and reward you." Now he had to depend upon his own legs, and after going a long way he came to a large town. There was much noise and bustle in the streets, for a man on horseback was making a proclamation. "The king's daughter seeks a husband, but anyone who wishes to sue for her hand must accomplish a hard task, and if he does not bring it to a successful issue, he will forfeit his life." Many had already attempted the task, but they had risked their lives in vain. When the youth saw the princess, he was so dazzled by her beauty he forgot all danger, and at once sought an audience of the king, and announced himself as a suitor. He was immediately led out to the seashore, and a golden ring was thrown into the water before his eyes. Then the king ordered him to fetch it out from the depths of the sea, and added, "If you come to land without it, you will be thrown back every time, until you perish in the waves." Everyone pitied the handsome youth, but they had to leave him standing solitary on the seashore. He was wondering over what he should do, when, all at once, he saw the three fishes swimming towards him. They were no others than the very ones whose lives he had saved. The middle one carried a mussel shell in his mouth, which he laid on the shell and the sand before the feet of the youth. When he picked it up and opened it, there lay the ring. Full of joy, he took it to the king, expecting he would be given the promised reward. The proud princess, however, when she heard that he was not her equal, despised him, and demanded he should perform yet another task. So she went into the garden herself, and strewed 10 sacks of millet seeds among the grass. "He must pick every one of these up before the sun rises tomorrow morning," said she. "Not a grain must be missing." The youth sat miserably in the garden, wondering how it could possibly be done. But as he could not think of a plan, he remained sadly waiting for the dawn, which would bring death to him. But when the first sunbeams fell on the garden, he saw the 10 sacks full to the top, and not a grain was missing. The ant king had come in the night with thousands and thousands of his ants, and the grateful creatures had picked up the millet and filled the sacks. The princess came into the garden herself, and saw with amazement that the youth had completed the task. But still she could not control her proud heart, and she said, "Even if she has accomplished these 2 tasks, he shall not become my husband till he brings me an apple from the tree of life." The youth had no idea where to find the tree of life. However, he started off, meaning to walk as far as his legs would carry him, but he had no hope of finding it. When he had traveled through 3 kingdoms, he was in none white, passing through a great forest, and he lay down under a tree to sleep. He heard a rustling under the branches, and a golden apple fell into his hand. At the same time, 3 ravens flew down and perched on his knee, and said, "We are the young ravens you have saved from death. When we grew big and heard you were looking for the golden apple, we flew across the sea to the end of the world, where the tree of life stands, and brought you the apple." The youth, delighted, started on his homeward journey, and took the golden apple to the beautiful princess, who had no further excuse to offer. They divided the apple of life, and ate it together, and then her heart was filled with love for him, and they lived happily to a great age. The Turnip. There were once 2 brothers, who both served as soldiers, and one was rich and the other was poor. The poor one, wishing to better himself, discarded his uniform and worked like a peasant. He then dug and hoed his little field and sowed turnips. The seed came up, and one of the turnips grew to such enormous size that it seemed as though it would never have finished, and though it had been called the Queen of Turnips, for its like had never been seen before, nor will ever be again. At last it was so big it filled a cart, and needed 2 oxen to draw it, and the peasant could not imagine what would come of it, or whether it would bring good luck or bad. And at last he said to himself, "If I sell it, what shall I gain? I might eat it with the little turnips. Well, they would do well for that. The best thing to be would to be taking it to the king and offer it to him." So he loaded a cart, harnessed 2 oxen, and took it to the court to present to the king. "What is this extraordinary object?" said the king. "I have seen many marvels in my time, but never anything so remarkable as this. What seed did it spring from? Perhaps it belongs to you, especially if you are a child of good luck." "Oh, no," said the peasant. "Lucky I am certainly not, for I am a poor soldier, who, since he could keep himself no longer, has hung up his uniform on a nail, and tills the earth. Further, I have a brother who is rich, and well known to you, my lord king, but I, since I have nothing, am forgotten by all the world." Then the king pitied him and said, "Your poverty shall be at an end, and you shall receive such rich presents from me that your wealth will equal that of your brother." Thereupon he gave him plenty of gold, lands, fields, flocks, and enriched him with precious stones, so that his brother's wealth could not be compared with his. Now when the rich brother heard what the brother with a single turnip had acquired, he envied him, and pondered how he might gain a like treasure for himself. But he wanted to show himself much cleverer, so he took gold and horses and presented them to the king, feeling certain he would give him a far handsomer gift, for if his brother got so much for a turnip, what wouldn't he get for such beautiful things? The king took the presents, saying he could give him in return nothing rarer or better than the huge turnip. So the rich brother had to put his brother's turnip into a cart and have it taken home. Then he did not upon who to expend his wrath and bitterness, till evil thoughts came to him, and he determined to kill his brother. He hired murderers who were to place themselves in ambush, and went to his brother and said, "Dear brother, I know of a secret treasure which we will carry off and divide." The other agreed, and went without suspicion. But when they got out, the murderer sprang upon him, bound him, and began to hang him on a tree. When they were about it, they heard in the distance the clatter of hoofs and the sound of singing, and it frightened them so much they stuck their prisoner into a sack, head foremost, and slung it up on a branch, and took to flight. But the man up in the sack worked a hole in it, and stuck his head through. Now the traveller turned to be nothing more than a student, a young fellow who was riding through the wood, singing cheerily. When the young man up in the sack saw the one down below, he called out, "Good day, you come in the nick of time." The student looked all around, but could not make out where the voice came from. At last he said, "Who calls?" A voice from somewhere up above answered, "Raise your eyes. I am sitting here in the sack of wisdom, and in a short time I have learnt so much that the wisdom of the schools is as air compared to mine. Soon I will be quite perfect, and shall come down and be the wisest of all mankind. I understand the stars and the signs of the heavens, the blowing of the winds, the sand of the sea, the healing of sickness, the power of herbs, birds, and stones. If you were once inside, you would feel what wonders flow from the sack of knowledge." When the student heard this, he was astonished, and said, "Blessed be the hour when I met you, for if only I might too get into the sack for a little while." The other answered, as though unwillingly, "I will let you in for a little while, for payment and kind words, but you must wait an hour, as there is something rather difficult, which I must learn first." But when the student had waited a little, he grew a little impatient, and entreated permission to get in, so great was his thirst for knowledge. Then the man in the sack pretended to give in, and said, "In order that I may get out of the sack, you must let it down, then you can get in." Though the student let it down, undid the sack, and released the prisoner, and said, "Now pull me up as fast as possible." He tried to get into the sack, and stand up all right within it. "Stop," said the other, "that won't do." He packed him in head first, tied it up, and slung up the disciple of wisdom, dangling him in the air, and said, "How are you, my dear fellow? You will soon feel wisdom coming upon you, and will have a most interesting experience. Sit still till you're wiser." Thereupon he mounted the student's horse and rode off, but someone sent down in an hour to let him down again. The water of life. There once was a king who was so ill that he was thought impossible that his life could be saved. He had 3 sons, and they were all in great distress on his account, and they went into the castle gardens and wept at the thought that he must die. An old man came up to them and asked them the cause of their grief. They told them that their father was dying, and nothing could save him. The old man then said, "There is one remedy of which I know. It is the water of life. If he drinks of it, he will recover, but it is very difficult to find." The eldest son said, "I will soon find it." He went to the sick man to ask permission to go in search of the water of life, as that the only thing that could cure him. "No," said the king, "the danger is too great. I would rather die." But he persisted so long that at last his king gave his permission. The prince thought, "If I bring this water, I shall be the favorite, and I shall inherit the kingdom." So he set off, and when he had ridden some distance he came upon a dwarf standing in the road, who cried, "Whither away so fast?" "Stupid little fellow," said the prince proudly, "what business is it of yours?" and rode on. The little man was very angry, and made an evil vow. Soon after, the prince came to a gorge in the mountains, and the further he rode, the narrower it became, till he could go no further. His horse could neither go forward nor turn round for him to dismount, so there he sat, jammed in. The sick king waited a long time for him, but he never came back. Then the second son said, "Father, let me go and find the water of life," thinking, "If my brother is dead, I shall have the kingdom." The king at first refused to let him go, but at last he gave his consent. So the prince started on the same road as his brother, and met the same dwarf, who stopped him and asked him where he was going in such a hurry. "Little snippet, what does it matter to you?" he said, and rode away without looking back. But the dwarf cast a spell upon him, and he too got into a narrow gorge like his brother, where he could neither go backwards nor forwards. This is what happens to the haughty. As the second son also stayed away, the youngest offered to go and fetch the water of life, and at last the king was obliged to let him go. When he met the dwarf, and he asked him where he was hurrying to, he stopped and he said, "I am searching for the water of life, because my father is dying." "Do you know where it is to be found?" "No," said the prince. "As you have spoken pleasantly to me, and I have not seen you to be haughty like your false brothers, I will help you and tell you how to find the water of life. It flows from a fountain in the courtyard of an enchanted castle, but you will never get in unless I give you an iron rod and 2 loaves of bread. With the rod strike thee 3 times on the iron gate of the castle, and it will spring open. Inside you will find 2 lions with wide open jaws, but if you throw a loaf to each, they will be quiet. Then you must make haste to fetch the water of life before it strikes 12, or the gates of the castle will close, and you will be shut in." The prince thanked him, took the rod and the loaves, and set off. When he reached the castle, all was just as the dwarf had said. At the 3rd knock the gate flew open, and one had to be pacified with the lions with the loaves, he walked into the castle. In the great hall he found several enchanted princes, and he took the rings from their fingers. He also took a sword and a loaf, which were lying by them. In passing into the next room he found a beautiful maiden, who rejoiced at his coming. She embraced him and said that he had saved her, and should come have the whole of the kingdom, and if he would come back in a year she would marry him. She also told him where to find the fountain with the enchanted water, but she said he must make haste to get out of the castle before the clock struck 12. Then he went on, and came to a room where there was a beautiful bed, freshly made, and though as he was very tired, he thought he would take a rest. So he lay down and fell asleep. When he woke up, it was striking 11:45. He sang up in a fright, and ran to the fountain, and took some of the water in a cup that was just lying near, and hurried away. The clock struck just as he reached the iron gate, and it banged so quickly that it took off a bit of his heel. He was rejoiced in having gotten some of the water of life, and hastened on his homeward journey. He again passed the dwarf, who said when he saw the sword and the loaf, "Those things will be of much service to you. You will be able to strike down whole armies with the sword, and the loaf will never come to an end." The prince did not want to go home without his brothers, and he said, "Good dwarf, can you not tell me about where my brothers are? They went in search of the water of life before I did, but they never came back. They are both stuck fast in a narrow mountain gorge. I cast a spell over them because of their pride." Then the prince begged so hard that they might be released to death. The dwarf yielded, but he warned them against them, and said, "Beware of them. They have bad hearts." He was delighted to see his brothers when they came back, and told him all that happened to them, how he had found the water of life, and brought a goblet full with him, how he had released a beautiful princess, who would wait a year for him, then marry him, and he would become a great prince. Then they rode away together and came to a land where famine and war were raging. The king thought he would be utterly ruined, so great was the destitution. The prince went to him and gave him the loaf, and with it he fed and satisfied his whole kingdom. The prince also gave him his sword, and he smote the whole army of his enemies with it, and then he was able to live in peace and quiet. Then the prince took back the sword and his loaf, and the three brothers rode on. But they had to pass through 2 more countries, where war and famine were raging, and each time the prince gave his sword and his loaf to the king, and in this way he saved 3 kingdoms. After that they took a ship and crossed the sea. During the passage the 2 elder brothers said to each other, "Our youngest brother found the water of life, and we did not. Our father will give him the kingdom for which we ought to have, and he will take away our fortune from us." This thought made them very vindictive, and they made up their minds to get rid of him. They waited until he was asleep, and they emptied the water of life from his goblet, and took it themselves, and filled up his cup with salt sea water. As soon as they got home, the youngest prince took his goblet to the king, so that he might drink of the water which was to make him well. But drinking only a few drops of the sea water, he became more ill than ever. As he was bewailing himself, his 2 elder sons came to him, and accused the youngest of trying to poison him, and said that he had the real water of life, and gave him some. No sooner had he drunk it than he felt better, and as soon as he became as strong and well as he had been in his youth. Then the 2 went to their youngest brother and mocked him, saying, "It was you that found the water of life. You had all the trouble, while we have the reward. You should have been wiser and kept your eyes open. We stole it from you when you were asleep on the ship. In the end your year comes, one of us will come and bring away the beautiful princess. But don't dare to betray us. Our father will certainly not believe you, and if you say a single word, you will lose your life. Your only chance is to keep silence." The old king was very angry with his youngest son, thinking he had tried to take his life, so he had the court assembled to give judgment upon him, and it was decided that he must be secretly got out of the way. One day the prince was going out hunting. Thinking no evil, the king's huntsman was ordered to go with him. Seeing the huntsman look sad, the prince said to him, "My good huntsman, what is the matter with you?" The huntsman answered, "I can't bear to tell you, and yet I must." The prince, say it out loud, whatever it is, I forgive you." "Alas," said the huntsman, "I am to shoot you dead. It is the king's command." The prince was horror-stricken, and said, "Dear huntsman, do not kill me. Give me my life. Let me have your dress, and you shall have my royal robes." The huntsman said, "I will gladly do so. I could have never shot you." So they changed clothes, and the huntsman went home, but the prince wandered away into the forest. After a time, 3 wagon loads of gold and precious stones came to the king for his youngest son. They were sent by the kings who had been saved by the prince's sword and his miraculous loaf, and now wished to show their gratitude. Then the old king thought, "What if my son really was innocent?" and said to his people, "If only he were here and still alive, I am sorry that I ordered him to be killed." "He is still alive," said the huntsman. "I could not find it in my heart to carry out your commands." And he took the king, and he told him what had taken place. A load fell from the king's heart upon hearing the good news, and he sent out a proclamation to all parts of his kingdom that his son was to come home, where he would be received with great favor. In the meantime, the princess had caused a road to be made of pure shining gold, leading to her castle, and told the people whoever came riding along it would be the true bridegroom, and they were to admit him. But anyone who came on either side of the road or the other would not be the right one, and he was not to be let in. When the year had almost passed, the eldest prince thought he would hurry to the princess, and by giving himself out as her deliverer, would gain a wife and a kingdom as well. So he rode away, and when he saw the beautiful golden road, he thought it would be 1,000 pities to ride upon it. So he turned aside, and rode to the right of it. But when he reached the gate, the people told him it was not the true bridegroom, and he had to go away. Soon after the second prince came, and when he saw the golden road, he thought it would be 1,000 pities for his horse to tread upon it. So he turned aside and rode up on the left of it. But when he reached the gate, he was also told that he was not the true bridegroom, and like his brother, was turned away. When the year had come quite to an end, the third prince came out of the wood to ride to his beloved, and through her to forget all his past sorrows. So on he went, thinking only of her, and wishing to be with her, and never even saw the golden road. His horse cantered right along the middle of it, and when he reached the gate it was flung open, and the princess received him joyfully, and called him her deliverer, and the lord of her kingdom. Their marriage was celebrated without delay, and with rejoicing. When it was over, she told him that her father had called him back, and forgiven him. So she went to the kingdom and told him everything, how his brothers had deceived him, and how they had forced him to keep silence. The old king wanted to punish them, but they had taken a ship, sailed away over the sea, and they never came back, as long as they lived. The King of the Golden Mountain. There was once a merchant who had 2 children, a boy and a girl. They were both small and did not old enough to run about. He also had 2 richly laden ships at sea, and just as he was expecting them to make a great deal of money from the merchandise, news came that they had both been lost. So now, instead of being a rich man, he was quite poor, and had nothing left to offer but one field near the town. To turn his thoughts from his misfortune, he went out into this field, and was both walking up and down. A little black mannikin suddenly appeared before him, and asked why he was so sad. The merchant said, "I would tell you at once if you could help me." "Who knows," answered the little mannikin, "perhaps I could help you." Then the merchant told him that all his wealth had been lost in a wreck, and he had nothing left but this field. "Don't worry yourself," said the mannikin. "If you will promise to bring me in 12 years' time the first thing that rubs against your legs when you go home, you shall have as much gold as you want." The merchant thought, what could it be but my dog? He never thought of his boy, but said yes, and gave the mannikin his bond signed and sealed, and went home. When he reached the house, his little son, delighted to hold on to the benches and totter towards his father, seized him by the leg to steady himself. The merchant was horror-stricken, for his vow came into his head, and now he knew what he promised to give away. But still he found no gold in his chest. He thought it must have been a joke of the mannikin's. A month later he went up into the loft to gather together some old tin to sell, and there he found a great heap of gold on the floor. So he was up in the world again, bought and sold, and became a richer merchant than ever, and was altogether contented. In the meanwhile the boy had grown up, and he was both clever and wise. But the nearer the end of the 12 years came, the more sorrowful the merchant grew. You could even see the misery in his face. One day his son asked him what was the matter, but his father would not tell him. The boy, however, persisted so long that he told him at last, without knowing what he was doing, that he had promised to give him up at the end of 12 years to a little black mannikin in return for a quantity of gold. He had given his hand and seal on it, and the time was now near for him to go. Then his son said, "Oh, father, don't be frightened. It will be all right. The little black mannikin has no power over me." When the time came, the son asked a blessing of the priest, and he as his father went to the field together, and the son made a circle within which they took their places. When the little black mannikin appeared, he took to the father, "Have you brought what you promised me?" The man was silent, but his son said, "What do you want?" The mannikin said, "My business was with your father, and not with you." The son answered, "You deceived and cheated my father. Give me back his bond." "Oh, no," said the little man, "I won't give up my rights." They talked to each other for a long time, and at last they decided that, as the son no longer belonged to his father, and declined to belong to his foe, he should get into a boat in a flowing stream, and his father should push it off himself, thus giving him up to the stream. So the youth took leave of the father, got into the boat, and his father pushed it off. Then, thinking that his son was lost to him forever, he went home and sorrowed for him. The little boat, however, did not sink. It drifted quietly down the stream, and the youth sat in perfect safety. It drifted for a long time, till at last it struck fast to an unknown shore. The youth landed, and seeing a beautiful castle near, walked towards it. As he passed under the doorway, however, a spell fell upon him. He went into all the rooms, but found them empty, till he came to the very last one, where a serpent lay, coiling and uncoiling itself. The serpent really was an enchanted maiden, who was delighted when she saw the youth, and said, "Have you come at last, my preserver? I have been waiting 12 years for you. This whole kingdom is bewitched, and you must break the spell." "How am I to do that?" he asked. "Tonight 12 black men hung with chains will appear, and they will ask you what you are doing here. But do not speak a word, whatever they do or say to you. They will torment you, strike, and pinch you, but don't say a word. At 12 o'clock they will have to go away. On the second night 12 more will come, and on the third 24. These will cut off your head, but at 12 o'clock their power goes, and if you have borne it, and not speaking a word, I shall be saved. Then I will come to you, and bring a little flask containing the water of life, from which I will sprinkle you, and you will be brought to life again, as sound and as well as ever you were." Then he said, "I will gladly save you." Everything happened just as she said. The black men could not force a word out of him, and on the third night the serpent became a beautiful princess, who brought her of wife, as were promised, and restored the youth to life. Then she fell on his neck and kissed him, and there were great rejoicings all over the castle. Their marriage was celebrated, and he became king of the Golden Mountain. They lived happily together, and in the course of time, a beautiful boy was born to them. When 8 years had passed, the king's heart grew tender within him as he thought of his father, and he went to go home to see him. But the queen did not want him to go. She said, "I know it will be to my misfortune." However, he gave her no peace till she agreed to let him go. On his departure she gave him a wishing ring, and said, "Take this ring and put it on your finger, and you will at once be the place where you wish to be. Only you must promise never to use it to wish me away from here, to be with you at your father's." He made the promise, and put the ring on his finger, and then he wished himself before the town where his father lived, and at the same moment he found himself at the gate. But the sentry would not let him in because of his clothes, though his rich material were of such strange cut. So he went up in a mountain where a shepherd lived, and exchanging clothing with him, put on his old smock, and passed into the town unnoticed. Whether he reached his father, he began making himself known, but his father, never thinking that he was his son, and that it was true that he had once had a son, but he had been long dead, but he added, seeing that he was a poor shepherd, he would give him a plate of food. The supposed shepherd said to his parents, "I am indeed your son. Is there no mark on my body from which you may know me?" His mother said yes. Her son has a strawberry mark under his right arm. He pushed up his shirt sleeve, and there was the strawberry mark. So they no longer doubted that he was their son. He told them he was a king of the Golden Mountain. His wife was a princess, and they had a little son, 7 years old. "That can't be true," said his father. "You are a fine sort of king to come home in a tattered shepherd's smock." His son grew angry, and without stopping to reflect, turned his ring around, and wished his wife and son to appear. In a moment they stood before him, but his wife did nothing but weep and lament, and said that he had broken his promise, and by doing so had made her very unhappy. He said, "I have acted incautiously, but from no bad motive," and he tried to soothe her. She appeared to be calm, but really she nourished evil intentions towards him in her heart. Shortly after, he took her outside the town to the field, and showed her the stream down which he had drifted in the little boat. Then he said, "I am tired. I want to rest a little." So she sat down, and he rested his head upon her lap, and soon fell fast asleep. As soon as he was asleep, she drew the ring from his finger, and drew herself gently away from him, and leaving only her slipper behind. Last of all, taking her child in her arms, she wished him back into her own kingdom, and when he woke up, he found himself quite deserted. Wife and child were gone. The ring had disappeared from his finger, and only her slipper remained as a token. "I can certainly never go home to my parents," he said. "They would still say I was a sorcerer. I must go away and walk until I reach my own kingdom again." So he went away, and at last he came to a mountain where 3 giants were quarreling about the division of their father's property. When they saw him passing, they called to him and said, "Little people have sharp wits," and asked him to divide their inheritance for them. It consisted of first of a sword, from which of one's hand, if one said, "All heads off, mine alone remain," every head fell to the ground. Secondly, of a mantle, which rendered anyone putting it on invisible. Thirdly, of a pair of boots, which transported the wearer to whichever place he wished. He said, "Give me all 3 articles, so that I may see that they are all in good condition." So they gave him the mantle, and at once he became invisible. He took his own shape again and said, "The mantle is good, now give me the sword." But they said, "No, we can't give you the sword. If you were to say, 'All heads off, mine alone remain,' all our heads would fall, and yours would be the only one left." At last, however, they gave it to him, on condition he was to tie it on to a tree. He did as they wished, and the sword went through the tree trunk as if it had been a straw. Then he wanted the boots, but they said, "No, we won't give them away. If you were to put them on and wish themselves on the top of the mountain, we would be left standing here without anything. He said, "No, I won't do that." So they gave him the boots too. But when he had all three, he could think of nothing but his wife and child, and said to himself, "If only I were on the golden mountain again." And immediately he disappeared from the sight of the giants, and there was an end to their inheritance. When he approached his castle, he heard sounds of music, fiddles and flutes, and shouts of joy. People told him his wife was celebrating her marriage with another husband. He was filled with rage and said, "The false creature! She deceived me and deserted me while I was asleep." Then he put on his mantle and went into the castle, invisible to all. When he went into the hall, where a great feast was spread with the richest foods and the costliest wines, and the guests were joking and laughing while they ate and drank, the queen sat on her throne in the midst in gorgeous clothing, with the crown on her head. He placed himself behind her, and no one saw him. Wherever the queen put a piece of meat on her plate, he took it away and ate it, and when her glass was filled, he took it away and drank it. Her plate and her glass were constantly refilled, but she never had anything, for it disappeared at once. At last she grew frightened, got up, went to her room in tears, but he followed her there too. She said to herself, "Am I still in the power of the demon? Did my preserver never come?" He struck her in the face and said, "Did your preserver never come? He is with you now, deceiver that you are. Did I deserve such treatment at your hands?" Then he made himself visible, went into the hall, and cried, "The wedding is stopped. The real king has come." The kings, princes, nobles who were present laughed at him to scorn, but he only said, "Will you go, or will you not?" They tried to seize him, but he drew his sword and said, "All heads off, mine alone remain." Then all their heads fell to the ground, and he remained sole king and lord of the Golden Mountain. Briar rose. A long time ago there lived a king and a queen, who said every day, "If only we had a child," but for a long time they had none. It fell out once, as the queen was bathing, that a frog crept out of the water onto the land, and said to her, "Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has passed, you shall bring a daughter into the world." The frog's words came true. The queen had a little girl who was so beautiful that the king could not contain himself for joy, and prepared a great feast. He invited not only his relations, his friends and acquaintances, but the fairies, in order that they might favorably and be kindly disposed towards the child. There were 13 of them in the kingdom, but as the king had only 12 golden plates for them to eat from, one of the fairies had to stay at home. The feast was held with all splendor, and when it came to an end, the fairies all presented the child with a magic gift. One gave her virtue, another beauty, a third riches, and so on, with everything in the world that she could wish for. When 11 of the fairies had their say, the 13th suddenly appeared. She wanted to revenge herself for not having been invited. Without greeting anyone, or even glancing at the company, she called out in a loud voice, "The princess shall prick herself with a distaff in her 15th year, and shall fall down dead." And without another word she turned and left the hall. Everyone was terror-struck, but the 12th fairy, whose wish was still unspoken, stepped forward. She could not cancel the curse, but could only soften it, and so she said, "It shall not be death, but a deep sleep lasting 100 years, into which your daughter shall fall." The king was so anxious to guard his dear child from the misfortune, he sent out a command that all the distaffs in the whole kingdom shall be burned. At this time all the promises of the fairies came true. The princess grew up so beautiful, modest, kind, and clever, that everyone who saw her could not but love her. Now it happened that on the very day she was 15 years old, and the king and the queen were far away from home, and the princess was left quite alone in the castle. She wandered about in the whole place, looking at rooms and halls as she pleased, and at last she came to an old tower. She ascended a narrow, winding staircase, and reached a little door. A rusty key was sticking in the lock, and when she turned it, the door flew open. In a little room sat an old woman with a spindle, spinning her flax busily. "Good day, Granny," said the princess. "What are you doing?" "I am spinning," said the old woman, and nodded her head. "What is the thing that whirls around so merrily?" she asked the princess, and she took the spindle and tried to spin too. But scarcely she had touched it before the curse was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger with the spindle. The second she felt the prick, she fell upon the bed that was standing near, and lay into a deep sleep, which spread over the whole castle. The king and queen, who had just come home, had stepped into the hall, went to sleep, and all of their courtiers with them. The horses went to sleep in the stable, the dogs in the yard, the doves on the roof, the flies on the wall, yes, even the fire flickering in the hearth grew still and went to sleep, and the roast meat stopped cracking. The cook, who was pulling the scullion's hair because he had made some mistake, let him go and went to sleep. The wind dropped on the trees in front of the castle, not a leaf stirred. But round the castle hedge of briar roses began to grow up. Every year it grew higher, till at last it surrounded the whole castle, so that nothing could be seen of it, not even the flags on the roof. But there was a legend in the land about the lovely sleeping Briar Rose, as the king's daughter was called, and from time princes came and tried to force a way through the hedge into the castle. They found it impossible, for the thorns, though as they had been hands, held them fast, and the princes remained caught in them without being able to free themselves, and so many died a miserable death. After many, many years, a prince came again to the country, and heard an old man tell of the castle which stood beyond the briar hedge, and which a most beautiful maiden called Briar Rose had been asleep for the last 100 years, and with her slept the king, queen, and all her courtiers. He knew also from his grandfather that many princes had already come and sought to pierce through the briar hedge, and had remained caught in it, and died a sad death. Then the young prince said, "I am not afraid. I am determined to go and look upon the lovely Briar Rose." The good old man did all in his power to dissuade him, but the prince would not listen to his words. Now, however, the 100 years was just ended, and the day had come when the Briar Rose was to wake up again. When the prince approached the briar hedge, it was in blossom, and was covered with beautiful large flowers, which made way of him of their own accord, and let him pass unharmed, and closed up again into a hedge behind him. In the courtyard he saw the horses and brindled hounds lying asleep, for on the roof of the dove sat with their heads under their wings. And he went into the house where the flies were asleep on the walls, and near the throne lay the king and queen, and in the kitchen was the cook, with his hand raised as though about to strike the scullion, and the maid sat with the black fowl in her lap, which she was about to pluck. He went on further, and so was all still that he could hear his own breathing. At last he reached the tower, and opened the door to the little room where the Briar Rose was asleep. There she lay, looking so beautiful he could not help but take his eyes off her. He bent down and gave her a kiss. As he touched her, Briar Rose opened her eyes and looked lovingly at him. Then they went down together, and the king woke up, and the queen, and all the courtiers looked at each other with astonished eyes. The horses in the stable stood up and shook themselves. The hounds leaped about and wagged their tails. The doves on the roof lifted their heads from under their wings, looked round, and flew into the fields. The flies on the wall began to crawl again. The fire in the kitchen roused itself and blazed up, and cooked the food. The meat began to crackle, and the cook boxed the scullion's ears so soundly he screamed aloud, while the maid finished cooking the fowl. Then the wedding of the prince and the Briar Rose was celebrated with all splendor, and they lived happily till they died.